Next on our docket is Tracey Cook. She is the Executive Director of Municipal Licensing and Standards for the City of Toronto.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I was quite honored when Michelle Trudel from Carole reached out and asked me to come out and speak about what we've gone through in Toronto, especially in relation to taxis and the new regulations that just came into play this year. Just by way of background, funny title, funny division name, Municipal Licensing and Standards. So my department is responsible for all the bylaw enforcement in the City of Toronto, which includes taxi regulation, limousine regulation, tow trucks, and a variety of other assorted businesses that keep me very busy. My life prior to that was actually that of a police officer in Toronto, so I've not spent my life in the taxi industry or the tourism industry. But certainly having the opportunity to do this review was an eye-opener for me. So I'll just take you a little bit through why I'm here, how I came to be here, some of what we've done, and tell you about our work. You might want to start the clock on me, because just like Matt, though I'm not from New York, I'm from Toronto, and I love to talk, especially when I've got a microphone. So I saw this, I thought, I think my staff would really appreciate this timer and would want to have it every meeting I'm speaking at. So I brought a presentation just to help guide the conversation today. For those of you who are not familiar, have not yet had an opportunity to visit the City of Toronto, we're the largest city in Canada, and a diverse population of approximately 2.8 million people living in Toronto proper. That does not include the GTA, which brings us north of a lot of millions. So what brought me here was the taxi industry review. I've been in this current role since January of 2012. I said it's coming up to 3 years, and some days it feels like 30, especially when I was dealing with the taxi review. It's a very complex industry, and Matt certainly has been involved in it for many years in New York, and you have to spend some time with the taxi industry to appreciate the complexity of it. Anyway, we just this year concluded a 3-year review with the industry. It was the industry that requested the review, and it was really around the regulations governing the taxi industry that had not been updated since 1998. When we saw that we needed to do this work and was directed to do this work by our City Council, we also recognized that accessibility in the taxi cab industry was an issue. Didn't realize truly at the onset how significant a scale of an issue that it truly was. The taxi industry in Toronto, we have over 5,000 licensed taxi cabs servicing over 65,000 trips per day. Estimated an industry worth over $1 billion or more. And when I came to realize the taxi service and how it was provided in the City of Toronto, and through this review, realized that we did not have any taxi cabs that were available for metered on-demand service for individuals who required wheelchairs for their mobility or had other devices that assisted with their mobility. In lieu, there were flat-rate service providers, and God bless them for doing the work, that provided the vehicles that allowed individuals to go from here to there with a call and not having to rely solely on the public transportation system, which is not always reliable or had to be booked 24 hours in advance. The struggle with this is that the flat-rate providers, and I'm sure many of the people here who have used those, may be the same in your city, were charging double and triple what a metered rate ought to be. So when I heard this and realized this, I obviously recognized this is something we need to do something about. So we also have the provincial framework, statutory framework, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. As France mentioned, I'm sure Quebec has the same regulations. It requires businesses, governments, buildings, everything to be more accessible or completely accessible. So we also had that piece of work to do, and that included transportation. And specifically on transportation as relates to taxi cabs, the AODA prescribes that every municipality has to consult on and take steps to determine the proportion of on-demand metered accessible taxi cab service. But at the same time, when you look at the definition of on-demand, what does that mean? And for some people, they felt as long as someone could call for a taxi cab or use an app, as many of our brokerages have, that was acceptable. And I didn't believe that that was. I think anybody should have the same choice. If I want to step out in the street and hail a taxi cab, to me that is accessible, that's equal, and that's on demand. So, of course, the challenge there was we're dealing with, as I mentioned, a very complex industry of a lot of very hardworking, historically involved taxi cab industry members with a lot of heart, but really a lack of cohesiveness and certainly not an understanding of the impact that not having a metered on-demand taxi cab service in the city meant. And I still think not realizing the opportunity that addressing that need provides. There's a few things that Toronto's doing, and certainly accessibility now is being framed into many of the works that different departments in the city are doing. A number of the strategies that the city has the responsibility to roll out, and these are just a few, but for seniors, accessibility design guidelines, etc. There's a lot of initiatives we're doing to make the streets more user-friendly and more accessible or inclusive, as I've preferred to reference it. So building our sidewalks and curbs, making the pedestrian crossings more visible, the signalized intersections having the audible notifiers as well, our transit shelters, etc. Making sure the streets and sidewalks are properly maintained, which is always a struggle for a municipality, ensuring snow is cleared and there's enough room for people to get by. I really, through this review, saw in this review when I started looking at the conversation around accessibility and the opportunities with tourism. So the City of Toronto really is a global city. We have a lot of fantastic attractions. We have wonderful neighborhoods, and is a global center for business. It's certainly the financial center for Canada. We like to say we're the center of the universe, but I know Montreal is. So I have to correct that. But we're also proud that we're going to be the host city for the Pan Am and Para-Pan Am Games next year. So obviously, you know, this coming out in short order and realizing how do we move people around. Just on a very brief note, the public transportation system, because I know this session is about transportation generally. So 32 of our 69 subway stations are currently accessible, all of our buses are accessible, and our new streetcars are accessible. There's still challenges. And the TTC, our Toronto Transit Commission, is working on those. We're doing a huge revitalization project, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars at Union Station, which is our central hub for our train service, GO trains, the Via Rail train, which is how I got up here. Thank you, Via, for being a sponsor as well. Wonderful way to travel. But we're ensuring that that facility, for people arriving at least at Union Station, that it's accessible and that we're ensuring the building modifications provide a barrier-free path of travel. In the city, we have a number of attractions. We know the CN Tower. We also have the Royal Ontario Museum, which is a significant tourist destination and has had modifications made to make it barrier-free. So when I look at Union Station, and I use the ROM as an example, if you come to Toronto in a wheelchair or other larger mobility device, how do you get there? How do you get here from there? And there's a gap there. As I mentioned, we had the flat rate providers, if you were able to arrange those in advance. Wheel-Trans is not available for non-residents. It's a subsidized public transportation system for people who are approved. So if you're a tourist to Toronto, you have extremely limited options. Has anybody traveled to Toronto at all? Anyone? I'm going to encourage you to come out now if you haven't before. But certainly, how do you get there or here from there? So then I said, how do we get there from here? And being where there's not that availability for people to move around freely as they wish by a taxi cab. And that was what was in my domain to address. Some of the challenges, and Matt, I'm sure, has referenced this, as is France and others. The legislation actually doesn't say 100%. It says a proportion, but it also says on demand. So there was a lot of conversation about what does on demand mean, what kind of demand is there for the service. And this is very much a chicken and egg problem. Because I said, how do we know what the demand is when we don't have the supply? And people know we don't have the supply, so they're not calling. So how do you measure that demand? So my response back was, you know, you look at those flat rate providers, and there are many, and people are paying double and triple what they ought to be paying to get there from here. So there is a demand there, and I think, you know, Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. I think as the service starts becoming available, people will see that. So as I mentioned, the taxi industry is quite complex, thousands of individuals involved in it. It's not a matter of 2 or 3 companies. It's thousands of individuals, individual owners. And a lot of the resistance to moving towards the 100% accessibility involved the capital costs, the operating costs, and again, that lack of demand was felt existed. People also look to what is currently the more prevalent accessible taxi cab in the city, all of whom have been tied up on our Wheel-Trans contract, but these were the vehicles people saw, the large vans that have been converted. And there's certainly some conversation to be had about that. Some people were concerned about the environmental impacts of the larger vehicles as well. So I'll speed up a little bit. So we started making the case for inclusiveness when I presented to City Council in a State of Two reports that this is not just the way it needs to be with these converted vans. There are opportunities, and again, I think if you build it, they will come. If we start showing that there's a demand and there's a need for this type of service, then will vehicle manufacturers come to the table? I didn't know the next speaker was going to be here today when I signed on, and it's certainly not meant to be fortuitous to him, though he's lucky. He's very lucky I'm going first. But you know, but it is that if there's a demand, then people are going to see that demand, and maybe we'll see more in supply. So we just presented a couple of examples. One of these happens to be the MV1. He wants me to stay on this slide. I'm going to keep moving. But you know, the innovations in inclusive design. The London Black Cab and Anne Fry was wonderful this morning, and London's been at it for a long time, and they've been successful. There's others out there. We're hearing talk about other innovations, possibly Karzan, manufactured out of Turkey. These are, I guess, concept cars at this time, but it doesn't hurt, at least the conversation is starting. So as well, through the review, I reached out and I noticed a couple of documents that came to my attention. One was the Martin Prosperity Institute, was a part of University of Toronto, really did a report called Releasing Constraints and really talked about the economic or potential economic impact of enabling accessibility in a city as it relates to tourism, education, workplace, retail. So very interesting information there. And the United Nations World Tourism Organization, I never imagined I'd be sitting here when I found that website, the declaration, and some of the guidelines for accessibility for tourism. And that really, these are articles and items that I used when I made our case at Council. So I'd like to think the City of Toronto has shown some leadership here. Many municipalities and jurisdictions are, and it's fantastic. Just to toot the horn for the Toronto Transit Commission, they are making the move towards 100% accessibility. You know, as it's a government agency, we all know taxes, et cetera, people get a little bit nervous. But they've got a plan and they're working towards getting to that 100% accessibility. So now for us. So some of the regulations that we were successful in having embedded in our new taxi rules dealt with improving overall accessibility in the taxi cabs. Passenger information monitors, you know, people with visual impairments, people with audible or auditory impairments, how do they know what they're being charged for their fare? And we heard through consultation concerns and issues arising. So we proposed a vehicle technology, a passenger information monitor that would make the fare visually seen and audibly available. So this is work that we're going to be going out to the market to determine what's out there, what can we bring in. Inclusion of Braille, there was some discussion about whether it's still relevant or not. It is still available for some people, they do use it. Let's get it on our taxi Bill of Rights and make it available. The training, and I didn't think it was that big of a deal till I started speaking with folks here. We've embedded the accessibility piece into our training. It used to be an option for drivers or for those who were going to provide the service with the contracted service providers. It is now mandatory. Every new taxi cab driver in the City of Toronto, we amended the training course to ensure that the accessibility aspects are included in that training. So every taxi cab driver here forward, every owner or driver that comes in on a refresher will have this accessibility requirement. And lastly, the license that we put forward, and I don't want to get into the complicated nature of the regulations, but what we purported was one license, one taxi cab license for the City of Toronto, and that taxi cab license ought to go on a vehicle that is inclusive design, that is wheelchair accessible. City Council took it one step further and said that this needs to happen, and this transition to the one license and accessible taxi cab by 2024. And that's where I was most proud of Council taking a position. So where we are to date, we had set an initial goal of 290 wheelchair accessible taxi cabs in time for the summer of 2015, next year for the Pan Am and Para-Pan Am Games. We are looking like we're going to surpass that. So right now we're over 359 taxi cabs are on their way to becoming accessible and on the road and available for metered on-demand taxi cab service in the City of Toronto. And thank you very much.